This is called exit strategies. Exit strategies means that that everything that we give money to has an end. If you give a multi-year renewable grant, at some point the likelihood is that that's going to come to an end, or at least you have to consider whether to renew it. Otherwise, you're giving an endowment, which we're going to come to as well. So that at some point there has to be a decision. What happens at the end? Moreover, it should be obvious. This seems to be a tautology, but we have to think about it. We give money to accomplish something. What do we want it to accomplish? Who is our target market for that? Or maybe we're our own target market because there are things that we want our foundation to accomplish. There may be other markets out there, community markets. So what do we want to accomplish? What are our deliverables at the end, and for whom? Number three is the reason we have exit strategies, is it helps us focus on what kind of relationship we want. And as is clear, if we're giving a relatively small gift to our alma mater, a few $100s, $1,000, that's not going to be a make or break gift to an Ivy League university such as Penn. And so that we would not assume that we have a major influential role if we're giving that level of gift to a major institution. On the other hand, there may be institutions where we choose to have a much more active role, and a sense of being an investor, a sense of being somebody who's on the board, a person who's able to help the organization grow to another level. And so our relationship with each of our grants or our funds can make a tremendous difference as to what kind of outcome we want with it. One of the things I want to point out is that we don't have to have the same relationship with everyone. It's sometimes a tendency, and I think at this point in the class you realize that that's not necessary. Some people say, oh my goodness, if I'm going to give money, I have to be on the board, or else we shouldn't give money, or if we're going to give money, we have to have these kinds of reports. Well, the truth is that not every thing that we give money to warrants that level of in-depth investigation, in-depth due diligence, and that kind of hands-on involvement. On the other hand, we should be thinking about that ahead of time, not at the end. And finally, we have exit strategies because, like it or not, circumstances can evolve. It turns out that it appears that the economy this year was far less radically impacted by what some people thought was going to be a major recession. We'll see. It doesn't seem to be there. But if this had been 2008 or 2009, that was certainly a circumstance where the finances of every foundation and almost every funder in the United States and elsewhere were significantly impacted. That's a circumstance that has something to do with the funder. There's also circumstances that can change with the nonprofit. We're going to come to all those things later. So the exit strategy session that I'm going to walk you through right now is essentially giving a structure to how to think about what we want to happen because we will have given our money. We're not going to discuss every piece of this in this presentation. There are certain slides, certain pages we're going to come to where you'll see it's blank. I want you to know that those are the sessions we're going to talk about in depth when we come back to this in our class together. And so if you turn the page, so the question is, okay, if one's developing an exit strategy, when do you do it? Well, interestingly enough, ideally, it should be a part of every grant decision. Whatever other considerations you have, this is something you should be considering as part of that discussion. Why are we doing this? What does it mean for us to do it? At the end of the day, is it going to make us happy or satisfied? Now, I'm going to pause here to tell you that one of the reasons I became so committed to this this session is because early on, I began to meet people, a lot of people in the funding world that complained about their satisfaction with their grant. Not so much their grantee, but with their grant. The more I asked the question, the more I realized that they had never thought through what was going to make them satisfied, would find it a gratifying a grant, or what they would want out of it. And so that, number one, they were depending on the nonprofit to guess that what was going to work. Or number two, as we'll see, sometimes at the last minute, they say, oh my goodness, I had this expectation. And they tell the nonprofit, they tell the grantee far too late in the process. So ideally, we think about these things up front and we communicate them at the time. Sometimes circumstances change. As I said, I gave the example of 2008, which is an easy example. But even if you want to go more recent than that, who among us in early 2019 would have imagined the impact of COVID on our lives and our grant making and our priorities? So there are circumstances on the grantee level and circumstances on the funder level that might force us to think about changes along the way and not simply at the beginning or at the end. If you turn the page, what we're going to talk about initially are what I would call deliverables. What are decisions we're going to make? What do we expect? Now, if we didn't talk about this yet, we should have. How long should a grant be? Now, some people say, well, we're going to give a one-year grant and we don't renew our grants for anybody. I would say that, except in very, very rare circumstances, that's not very astute grant making. An organization can't really organize around it. It means that we really deeply have no commitment to that organization. What we're doing is we're just throwing our money all over the place. There may be limited circumstances where that makes sense. An organization is doing a 50-year anniversary and they're looking for something just for that year as a sponsorship, or there's there is an exigency because of a shortfall, and there was a one-year grant to somehow tide an organization over. I'm not saying it never works, but an assumption that in most cases we think in terms of at least renewals, if not multi-year grants. The question is, what does somebody need to know? Is our policy that the nonprofit, the NGO, can approach us and ask for the same amount, for additional amounts, for lesser amounts? What would they, and what are the conditions that they would have to meet? Is it that they have certain metrics that they'd have to do in terms of the numbers of people served, or the number of matching dollars that are raised, or moving it to their core budgeting? What are some of the conditions that would make a difference for us to decide whether we would renew that grant? If that's the case, if we have those, and hopefully we do, we should at the very beginning tell the grantee what our ground rules are. That doesn't mean we're promising a renewal if it turns out that some of those conditions aren't there, but it means that the grantee should know upfront what it means to get the initial grant, and not have to second guess, and not have to know, and not have to see this as a vulnerable part of their income source that they can't plan appropriately for in the future. So if you look at the next page, the first deliverable is evaluation. Now, since we've discussed that in class in some depth, this should be a clear one. In other words, that if it turns out that one of our expectations is that there be an evaluation of a program, of a project, or some larger entity, we've already discussed how to go about that. Who should do it? When it should be done, who should pay for it. That should be part of the discussion. We've already had it. You should be able to fill in already what would be appropriate if you expected an evaluation to be done as part of a project. Once again, though, bear in mind, you should tell the grantee up front that that's going to be an expectation. Okay, next page. Okay, now then this page is, this may seem obvious, but actually it comes to a couple of very sensitive issues. And I want to start actually with the bottom bullet point. When we give money to a nonprofit organization, an NGO, or any other entity, bear in mind that we're providing funding to them to do something. They're not working for us, they're working for themselves. We are enabling it. Therefore, from a legal perspective, from an intellectual property perspective, the grantee owns the results of that work. They own the data. They own the photographs. They own whatever is involved in that. In most cases, most nonprofits are going to want to share some of those findings with you, but bear in mind, you don't. It's not as if we have an automatic claim on them. That has to be something that is shared and with the agreement of the nonprofit. If, on the other hand, we really do want to own the project, then we should do a different kind of giving of money, and that's called a contract. And the difference between a contract and a grant is that in a contract, they are working for you. They're enabling a project on your behalf. If you have a plumber who does work in your home, you haven't given them a grant to own your home. You've given them a grant they're on contract to do some work for you. So one of the things that the places this often comes up is, what do you do with the results? Who's authorized to publish them? Who's authorized to disseminate them? Now, very often we as funders do want to disseminate the results for all sorts of reasons, sometimes in our own public reports to the public, but sometimes we're funders that are committed to funding in a particular field of service. We care about early childhood. We care about homelessness. We care about investing in medical research. And so what we often will make grants in those terms to a variety of entities, research entities, who are going to give the result, tell the results. And what we want to do as funder is to be able to prepare a kind of a summative report of all of the different kinds of projects consistent with our field of service. That's perfectly legitimate to do, but you need the buy-in from each of the organizations up front. More to the point, you have to tell them what it is that you're going to want to keep track of. Because if you ask every organization to just keep records, they may decide that the records that are most relevant to them are not exactly the ones that you would find most useful in doing a summative report. So bearing those kinds of things in mind, who owns the material and what do you want to do with it if you're going to publish or disseminate it, allows you to clarify those things up front as part of your negotiation with a grantee when you decide to give them some money. The next page, we talk about the next deliverable is longevity. You give money to a project that you want to outlast your funding or our funding. You want to startup funds or initial funding or ambition funding. And that's not uncommon. I'm sure that among us, there are people who have funded things with your ambition is that at the end of whatever your first 3 year, 5 or 6 or 7 years are, that there's some other place that the nonprofit has turned to fund it, that maybe they've gotten an endowment, maybe they have other people that are funding it. What's important in this one is that's a perfectly legitimate expectation. But it shouldn't be an expectation that you spring upon the nonprofit when you're at the end of your funding. And the reason for that is because as much as any other kind of grant making, it's important to organize how you give your money in a way that's most likely to yield these results. Over the years, I've known a variety of funders who have started extraordinarily interesting projects and funded extraordinarily interesting projects, but never made it clear that in their mind they were going to stop funding at a certain point. And they had never themselves or asked the nonprofit itself to invest in getting partners, figuring out whether to use these grants as challenge grants or matching grants, and so that it's important from the very beginning to say, yes, we're giving you this money with the expectations, with the honest expectation that this will outlast us, whether it'll outlast it in perpetuity or for a number of years. And therefore, what do we need to do together to make sure that our startup funds are going to be most effectively used by you to get the results that we both want? On the next page, we talk about capacity building. And now capacity building is something that many funders do at the end of funding. In other words, that it may be that we as a funder said, we're never going to give more than 5 years of funding, but we still care about you. And while we may not be willing to give more money for this project or to this organization, that doesn't mean that we're not committed to the field as a whole or to our community as a whole. And so that there's lots of funders that are willing to provide capacity building support, even when direct funding support, grant making support has come to an end. So then among the ways in which this happens is convening groups of grantees for educational purposes or for group sharing purposes or for networking purposes, to provide training grants independent of project grants, so that the development officer knows how to do it better, or the back office technical people have achieved the training that they need to do what they need to do, or the record keeping people are up to date on how to use the best technology or the best indicators of meaningful data. And so that's another way in which we as funders can help an organization be effective, be more effective even after our grants come to a conclusion. Sometimes we'll provide consulting services. We may not provide direct grants, but we recognize at the end of our funding that there's certain kinds of needs that continue in that organization, and we're committed to providing consulting services, especially if it turns out it's something we're doing with a whole bunch of organizations at the same time. So we might be able to contract, just to take an example, but it was an easy one, contract with an evaluator who's going to be able to provide consulting support for a variety of our grantees at the same time, or development consultant. Another area that's very often a useful way in which we can provide capacity building is to do board building. You know that in the end of the day, the effectiveness of the board, the funding of capacity of the board, and the visioning of a board makes all the difference as to whether an organization is going to succeed or fail. And so that we may very well be committed to seeing ourselves as a resource for providing the board support for all of our agencies at the same time. On the next page, we come to another longer-term view of what our funding is about. Quite often, people will say, look, we can't fund a project for all over the country. Our funding capacity is limited. But we think there's a really interesting idea out there. What we want to do is fund a model program that can be replicated all over the place. Now, before we talk about the ways in which we do this, let me tell you the ways in which this often doesn't work. What often happens is that a model program is a result of a very creative programmer or executive who intuitively senses what would make a new idea effective. Very often, those very creative types are not self-reflective. They don't document exactly how they made their decisions. And so what happens is that after a period of time, they've done a successful program, they go to a conference, they tell everybody about this great program, and a year later, everybody comes and says, well, we tried to do the same thing and it didn't work. And the reason for it is because the person who created the model in the first place probably never went through the sophistication, the rigor of documenting all the kinds of decisions, why certain decisions were made, what questions were answered along the way. So if we're serious about developing replicable models, it's very important for us at the very beginning to develop that documentation. What is the data and the information that's going to be useful to know what's replicable and what's not? What are the questions that were asked along the way, and why were they answered a certain way? It may turn out that in community A, the answer to those questions leads to one way of doing things. But in communities B, C, and D, the same question may have a very different answer, even though it will yield an effective program along the original model. One of the things that we have talked about, we're going to come back to before we finish the class, is what didn't work. There is no such thing as perfection, at least in this world. There's always things that are tried that don't work. There's projects that we fund that don't work. Well, if we're developing a model program, it's as useful to tell those that would like to replicate what we have funded, that they know what questions were tried and didn't yield the answers and expectations that were hoped for as the ones that did work. And then finally, if we do intend to fund replication, what's our role in that? Are we planning to do seed funding in 10 places around the United States or around the world? Is there a way in which we're going to go back to publication? Are we going to publish a how-to guide? Are we going to pay for our creative, the creative innovator to go to conferences along with the person who's developed the questions to be able to answer the how-tos, the documentation? Are we going to provide for all those services so that the replication actually has a good chance of success and not dependent on a passively looking at a straightforward publication or a publicity piece that doesn't answer all of our questions? Replication can be a great tool to have a leveraging of our resources, but only if we do it in such a way that we really are leveraging the effectiveness of our model and not simply the idea of our model. Next page, please. Okay. Now, there are, for the next section, we're going to be spending a lot more time in class, and we're not going to discuss them right now. Of the exit strategies that are on the positive side, endowments are a very, very useful tool. They sometimes can be made in a way that they're counterproductive, or the restrictions are counterproductive, or some elements weren't thought through. We're going to talk about endowments. To prepare yourself for, a very, very current example is looking at some of the endowments that were used in the universities in Florida, especially at New College, and what happened to them when there was a political intervention for funding purposes. It's a very interesting, very contemporaneous case study about, to put it on the table, an abuse of endowments and how some of the funders have responded. In the next page, we're going to talk about if you give a building. It is not uncommon for funders to decide to give a building at their university, at a hospital, in some other place. What should our expectations be? What's going to make that a successful decision? What do we need to think about? What do we need to put on the table in our own mind, but more particularly on the table when we talk about giving a building to a nonprofit, and what needs to be on their mind at the same time? So they're going to discuss that as well. Now, in the next page, we're going to begin the section of the situations where we're going to discontinue funding. All of the cases we talked about before were where our expectation was, and the facts were that we gave our money and it went all the way through, and we talked about what to think about at the beginning. The section 4 and the next several pages we're going to talk about completely in the class. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but we're going to look at the various situations, and we're just quickly going to list all the circumstances, and we're going to, and you may want to think ahead of time, if you were to fill in the bullet points on each of these, what would be the conditions? What are the ethics? What are the ground rules? What are the circumstances that you would bring to play in each of the circumstances where discontinued funding is called for? So number one, the first situation, your funding has been regular, but is non-essential to the continuing the funded project. Okay, that's circumstance one. Can you just stop funding? Does it matter? Do you have to give the notice? Do you have to do anything else? Is there an ethic connected with it, a particular ethic or a sense of responsibility? We'll talk about that. In the next case, number two, you feel that the project has not reached its potential, but you're not blaming the organization. Failure is legitimate. If you don't want to hold it against every organization for failure. They've done their best. There may be all sorts of exigencies. I mean, let's take the most obvious of the last several years. How many organizations could possibly have anticipated COVID? In 3 months earlier, 5 months earlier, we may have made a grant for a very creative, innovative project. And 6 months later, there's just no way in the world that they had the capacity to institute that. What's our responsibility if that happens? Now, here's a more common. Now we're getting into a muddier area. You want to explore discontinuing funding because you feel that the organization has failed to live up to what it claimed it wanted to do. Not that it failed in trying to do it, but you feel that it didn't live up to what it claimed it wanted to do, either in its proposal or its discussions with you, or the way in which it was going to go about things. What are our responsibilities there? What are our ethical responsibilities there? And finally, what if it's us? What if the organization has done nothing wrong? They've done an outstanding job. We have funded them for a long time, and they just we don't have as much money anymore. We lost a third of our money in the recession, or we've decided to spend down, and there's going to be an endpoint to the funding, and we want to that discontinuation is just a fact of life. What are the conditions there? So what are the ground rules for exit strategies? And this is crucial for all of our grant making, but the exit strategies just gives us another way to know when to put our ground rules on the table and how to think about these things. So number one, grantees only know what our expectations are if we tell them. There's just no way for to play. It's not fair. It's not good, and frankly, it leads to frustration and disappointment on both sides if we don't clarify our expectations. It's our responsibility to define those relationships and what our expectations are. But a grantee has a right to say, wait a minute, we don't think your expectations are legitimate or doable or meet the standards that we think are appropriate. An example that may or may not have come up in the class, is a situation where a funder, this is a real life case, a very prominent philanthropist, gave a very substantial grant to do volunteer after-school programs for high school kids. And very interesting thing to do, not bad. But his expectation to the grantee and to the evaluator was he wanted to know within a year how lives have been changed by this program. And that was going to be the determination of whether or not to give additional money. Now, at this point, we've been through the class. I don't need to tell you all of the things that are wrong with that kind of expectation. Whether it's something you could do over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, maybe, but certainly to think that you can measure the changing lives of people within less than a year as a determination as to whether to give more money, it's an overreach by the funder. And hopefully the nonprofit should say, we can't do that. We think you're funding a program that's really worth funding. Can we make refinements in your expectation? Can we make refinements in your expectations of numbers? Can we say, and whatever else has to be there? We have the responsibility to establish the relationship, but we have an equal responsibility to make it safe for a nonprofit to say to us that our expectations, our definitions of that relationship are not doable either at the financial level or at the conceptual level. And let's go back and talk about it again. And finally, as I said much earlier, the earlier we make the earlier we establish our expectations, the more likely the grant will prove gratifying on both sides. And conversely, the later we do it, the more likely it is that there's going to be frustration and disappointment on both sides. And there's a very strong likelihood that the nonprofit is not going to be able to deliver what in the back of your mind was your expectation from the grant. So that's why we have this section on exit strategies and looking at the ground rules. And when we're together, we're going to go through those sections that I've asked you to think about in anticipation of then. If you have any questions about the rest of it, by all means, but we're not going to focus any attention on the rest of the presentation except where the blank slides were, unless you have specific questions. So thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you. We're going to be discussing it virtually, and I look forward to seeing you at the time. Thanks.